Hello and welcome. The Purdue Institute for the Study of the Iranian World welcomes you to another episode of our podcast, Legacies of Ancient Persia. Join us as we further explore the many legacies of ancient Persia and its relevance to global patrimony. Hello everyone and welcome to the Season 3 finale of Legacies of Ancient Persia. We have made it to the end of the 2025-2026 academic year, and we hope you've enjoyed this season as much as we have. Also, a really quick note and an apology from me. I was traveling when I was recording this episode, so I had to use my emergency travel mic, which means that it was just the mic for my headphones and not my normal recording microphone. This week's guest is Dr. James Howard-Johnston, an emeritus fellow at Corpus Christi College at the University of Oxford. In this episode, we discuss his research on the Byzantine army, his interests in Sasanian Iran through teaching and conferences on Roman-Persian relations, his interests in Sasanian silver coins, minting, and iconography, and he outlines the chronology and sources for Rome-Sasanian conflict. We hope you enjoy this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give our show a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify.
Excellent. Well, the first thing I want to do is thank you for joining me on this podcast this beautiful morning. And the second thing I'm going to do is ask you, how did you get into the study of ancient history and classics and Byzantine history? And let's go with history.
Well, the answer is not entirely to my credit. In England, this is still the system. We have to specialize at the age of 15 or 16, so choose 3 subjects to do at what's called advanced level. And when we got to that stage at school, I was being urged to do the sciences, but I thought I had much better grounding in the humanities. So I turned away from the sciences. And what I did for A-level was Latin, Greek, and ancient history. So that's what I did at school. And then coming up to university, in my case, Oxford, I got in to read classics. And then I did read classics, though I did something unusual in those days. I skipped the first half of the traditional degree, which was focused on Greek and Latin literature, because in a sense, I'd done it all at school. So I did a short two-term course, and then got straight on to the second half, the main half of the degree, which was philosophy and history. And at the very start of this process, in the 2 terms before I got on to that, it was a short course basically designed for people without very good Greek or Latin to get into it. And so fairly easy texts were prescribed. And one of those texts, the one which I did, was Xenophon's, so the return of the Greeks from Persia. And I was taught the awful things, I've forgotten his name, but he was a great man. He's a New Zealander by origin. And so that was my first introduction to Persia in my first term at Oxford. Then going on to the main part of the degree, my Greek history tutor was a man called David Lewis. And it so happened that David Lewis combined knowledge of classical history, Persian history, and biblical history. Now, we didn't get much of that in our tutorials, but we had some. So Persia was again there. And then I do research, which was on the Byzantine army. And then I get a job. And basically, my research ultimately gets guided by my teaching. So subjects that were on the syllabus, I would then get into it, and so new interests would get generated. So whereas I think now quite often certainly in Britain, people's teaching is largely guided by research. My research was largely guided by my teaching. And one of the subjects that I taught from fairly early on was, well, it was set up by the great Peter Brown, who now at Princeton, and it was called The Near East in the Age of Justinian and Muhammad. Now, a crucial component of that was relations between Romans and Sasanian Persians. So I taught that for many years. But I wouldn't say that I was any sort of expert on Persian history. But what I knew, of course, was that I was dealing with a very powerful, well-organized state, capable of projecting its authority east and west and south, and more than capable of facing the Roman Empire on equal terms. So the years pass by, and we come into the 1990s, and I go to, well, in fact, I went to all of them. There was a series of conferences organized in London on the Byzantine and early Islamic Near East. And the third of these conferences was on states, resources, and armies. And the subject I had was looking at the two great powers and basically arguing that the Sasanian Empire was a centralized, bureaucratically developed, efficient organization. The basic reason for arguing that was its ability to project power. But in the course of writing the paper, I also looked at its infrastructure development, its ability to concentrate resources and invest them in developing large irrigation schemes, particularly in the area of the Sasanian capital, Ctesiphon, but also in Khuzestan and up on the Iranian plateau. So that basically tells you how I come into it. And since then, I've been every now and again writing papers for conferences on different aspects of the Sasanian institutions. So I've written about the army. I've written about the monetary system. I mean, that's almost the best proof that we're dealing with a well-organized entity in that it has sort of an average, I suppose, about 30 to 40 mints, all producing coins to the same high standard, to the same design, and changes come in simultaneously at all the mints. So you can't gainsay that, and so on. So basically, that's me. That's me and Iran. But to which I add two things, because I went basically as soon as I could, and that's sort of rather late in the day. But someone called Maria Brosius, who at the time was at Oxford at Queen's College, she'd been rather nervously to the Islamic Republic in the early 1990s and had then seen what things were like. And she organized an expedition of Oxford academics, one or two others, in 1998. I mean, I can't remember, but there were about 14 of us. And 3 weeks of traveling, flying out to Tehran, then going west to Takhti Suleiman. And then we did, I mean, it was wonderful. It was wonderful. It was the best front trip I've ever had. Then going to Hamadan, going down to Kermanshah, then going along to Khuzestan, and then up into Fars proper, down to Bam, past Yazd, then Shiraz, and working our way back to Tehran. It was absolutely wonderful. And one had very good companions, not least Bert Smith, who was the professor of Greek archaeology at Oxford, interested in statuary. And on sites, my thing was I would simply follow Bert and listen to what he was saying. And then 4 years later, so a year after 9/11, I organized a trip to see the other half of Iran. Again, there were about 14 of us. And we went due east it was again 3 weeks, due east from Tehran, ending up at Mashhad and then Bandian on the Turkmen border, then going up to Gorgan and the Great Wall. That took about half our time, and then we spent the other half in Azerbaijan. And that, again, was wonderful. So love of Iran, well, respect for Iran comes first. through, study, reading texts, looking at images. Love of Iran comes from those 2, 3 week trips.
That sounds so lovely. I'm sure a lot of people wish they could go visit, but it doesn't seem like that's going to be a thing anytime soon.
Poor Iran.
Yes,
Poor
or
Iran. Of course, I'm afraid at the moment all my feelings are with the Iranians.
yeah, my thoughts and certainly everyone's thoughts that I know with the people of Iran right now, because it's a very difficult situation, and we just hope that
Yeah.
something positive comes from the whole situation.
Well, and they are misunderstood by the outside world. So I'm always telling them that basically, if you were thinking in terms of having to wear the hijab is one thing, but it doesn't affect the opportunities for women in terms of universities and jobs. And they do have a functioning democratic system. It's just got a clerical controls around the end of it. So that they are I would say, the most democratic and well-educated people in the Middle East. But when we were there this second year, so it was a year after 9/11, there were no tourists
Oh,
to speak of. I mean, we saw 5 French tourists in the mosque in Tabriz. And apart from that, we saw no other foreign tourists. We saw Iranian tourists. And I think we went to something like 86 sites. But wherever we went, the Iranians were viewing tourists as sort of as things to admire. And they would say tourists, and clear the way for us. And so absolutely delightful place, delightful people.
oh, I love that. Well, we can get back to our love of the culture of Iran, but
Right.
one thing that is sort of on my mind is, since you have studied a lot of Byzantine history, I am curious because a lot of obviously new research and other interesting sort of assertions have come out in the last like 5 years, let's say, in terms of Byzantine studies. And I know that Anthony Caldelis has written extensively about how he doesn't like the term Byzantine. He loves
Uh-huh.
using the term sort of New Roman Empire. So I'm just wondering, like, where do you kind of fall on that? Like, do you think there's still a value in calling it Byzantine for reasons of just that's what the field has been called, that's what it is? Or do you have any strong feelings about people trying to shift the conversation to like, no, it's just New Roman Empire?
Well, of course, I'm of a different generation where the customary usage simply prevailed. But I like using it as an indicator of a fundamental change in the position of Romans. And of course, the Byzantines call themselves Romans. But there was a fundamental change, and I give it a precise date, which is absurd. But the precise date is 644 in the autumn, when the Caliph Umar I goes down to Jar, the port of Medina, to watch the arrival of the first grain fleet from Egypt. Now, that seems to me to mark the change from a sort of a Roman-dominated world to a caliphate-dominated world. And from the point of view of Byzantium, it's marking the stage when an empire basically became a sort of rump state, fighting desperately for its survival. So I see fundamental change in terms of it becomes a much tighter knit state. It's culturally rather denuded, and it's fighting a guerrilla war of defense for 2 years. I mean, it's basically a sort of medieval Vietnam, except that it had to fight for 6 times as long to
Mhm.
survive. And then you've got the effect on its culture afterwards. So it seems to me convenient to mark a fundamental change between a Roman imperial world, which was a genuine empire, and the Byzantines, of course, had imperial pretensions, but not in reality. I mean, there was an expansionist phase, late 9th, 10th century, early 11th century, when it was sort of military, but it wasn't reaching any sort of imperial scale. It's simply one of six major powers competing for territory and prestige in the Middle East.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I personally don't have issues calling it the
Yeah,
Byzantine Empire, but I've just encountered people with very strong feelings about it. And so it's always fun for me to ask people who are sort of more in that field how
yeah.
they feel about it.
Well, funnily, Anthony Caldelis, he's a, he's he's a fine scholar. But he's written sort of whole books designed to prove something, which I'm afraid seems to me fairly obvious, which is that the Byzantines were Romans. They're Romans. They've basically got Roman institutions. They've got Greek culture. They've got the Christian religion. And those are simply givens. So I've written recently a short potted history of Byzantium, unlike Caldelis's, which runs to 1,100 pages and is a very weighty volume and goes into enormous detail about the domestic history, which is interesting. All history is interesting, but it seems to me less sort of important than the external relations. So my book is called Byzantium in a changing world, where what I'm interested in is how this entity survived from the 7th century catastrophes to 1453. And I do it in 250 pages.
That's fantastic. Well, I'll have to link that in the show notes for people so they can go find the book. And if they would like to, if they already own Anthony Caldelis's book, The New Roman Empire, they can put them
Yeah.
side by side the
Yes,
shelf,
and
and then you can
the weight of the one and the lightness of the other. Yes.
exactly, and then they can sort of judge for themselves what they want to take from it. That'd be kind of a fun exercise. But you mentioned you obviously look at sort of the external relations, you look at several different aspects of late antiquity. You mentioned coinage, which kind of always gets sparks my interest because I also take a very personal interest in coinage. And I have to confess, I don't really know that much about Persian coinage. I mean, I did such a small portion of numismatic history when I was in school. So, in case anyone in the audience who may be listening to this episode also wants some clarification, hopefully I'm going to start out by asking maybe some simple establishing questions. And that is, what coins were they using? What were they made out of? Were they the sort
They're
of
silver.
normal silver?
They're silver. They are drachms, so that's related to. It's a sort of Greek term originally. They're drachms. God, if you ask me the weight of them, can I say offhand? It's a few grams, and it's remarkably pure silver. And the standard is maintained for 400 years. And they have, on the obverse, there is an image of the king, the Shahanshah, and different kings can be distinguished through their crowns.
Mhm.
On the reverse, there's a flower altar and two flower attendants. That's the basic scheme, but obviously it changes through time. And the wonderful thing that happens through time is that I'm nervous about going astray. They introduce mint names onto the coins. Wonderful. Now they're quite hard to decipher and to identify. They introduce mint names and they introduce regnal years. So then the coinage becomes of immense use. And they were issued in huge quantities, basically for exchange. Well, I suppose the fundamental purpose of coinage originally, I mean, when it was first devised in the Greek world, is basically for government payments to soldiers, officials, for projects. But then, of course, it spreads into use for everyday exchange. Now, I would say that all the signs are that the Sasanian Empire was highly monetarized. And I'm sure there's barter going on, but the coins are ubiquitous. Now, as well as the silver, they have a copper coinage, which is much less studied. but for, everyday exchange, purchases, and so on. So, for example, Merv, which is in the northeast, near the frontiers, near the Oxus, and which has been well excavated, first by Russians, then by joint British, Russian, or maybe Turkmen team. They found a lot of copper coins, which correlate with periods when we know Sasanian troops were massing in the east for campaigns. So this is telling us that obviously they were being paid in silver, but there is the copper. The copper is in circulation, and there's a lot of it. What they don't have, save really for ceremonial coins, is gold coinage. So you have a Roman world where there really isn't a silver coinage. I mean, there are some silver coins, but it's basically gold. And you have a Sasanian world where it's silver. And the two then get merged in the Caliphate, which has gold dinars and silver dirhams. The dinars being slightly lightweight Roman solidi, and the dirhams basically Sasanian drachms with the new order, without, and this is the all-important thing, extraordinary thing, without images of the ruler from the 690s. It is simply, it's a coinage issued for the faithful to Allah. So it's epigraphic with little religious slogans on them.
Interesting. I mean, it makes sense to me because I do know, yeah, silver was highly in use. Yeah, people definitely had copper. When gold was introduced, it was there. Where was the gold coming from? I mean, obviously by then there are a lot of competing powers around, so I'm always like gold always is very present in antiquity. People get it from places. A lot of times it would come from Egypt. But by the time I feel like as you get later and later, and then you have more of kind of different geographical areas start to be chopped up.
Yeah.
And of course there's trade. So, but it's like, would the gold basically come in through trade? Is there a place where they could get it themselves, like mine it
Yeah, I'm
themselves?
afraid you're stretching my knowledge. I could look it up. I would, for within the Roman Empire, for silver, we know the principal source was Spain first, and then in the Balkans. For gold, I don't know, but I'm sure it wasn't all imported. There are probably gold mines in Spain. There are some. There was some. But basically, the answer to that question is I don't know. As regards to silver in the Sasanian Empire, well, there are plenty of silver mines, especially as you go east. The great sort of silver boom was in the 9th and 10th centuries in what's now Afghanistan.
Mhm.
And that funds a huge expansion of Muslim coinage, and of which we get traces in the northern world of Scandinavia. There are huge quantities of dirhams found in hoards, large hoards, across Russia, Poland, Scandinavia, and it gets to England too.
Mhm.
So no, there's certainly no problems about silver for the Sasanians. I have a feeling that the Romans were getting gold from what's now the territory of Hungary, from the Carpathians, but I'm not sure. I'm guessing, I'm flailing.
No,
Academics
it's fine.
academics flail when they get to the edge. They get to the edge of their knowledge, and I'm flailing.
No, it's fine. I mean, that's the thing about academia. There's so much history. There's so much. One can't possibly know everything, and it's an incredibly large period of history. So I think you can definitely be forgiven. I mean, I guess I'll just pivot and say, in terms of, what's on the coins, you've mentioned that the Persian kings can be identified by their specific symbols or unique
Yeah.
crowns. I'm curious because as well as the Persian stuff, you also know the Byzantine stuff. Are there examples of like co-regencies, shared sort of iconographies on coins, or is not really a thing? Because I know that became very popular during like iconoclasm and stuff when you would
Yeah.
have like the king and then the direct heir, but I don't know about other places.
Well, because someone will probably gainsay me, but I don't think we don't get that on Sasanian coins. We do get it in rock reliefs where there is, as it were, a co-ruler may appear. I should say that there's a very good series of publications on Sasanian coinage based on the museum collections in Paris, Vienna, just probably somewhere else. And there are now, I think, about 6 volumes. We haven't got the last one for Khusro II, but they are wonderful and beautifully produced. So everything one could want to know about Sasanian coinage is in this Siligi Numorum Sassanidarum.
No, I think that's a great resource. I'll try to find stuff and put stuff in the show notes for the audience as well, because if they're like me and they're curious, they're gonna go find all these resources and keep looking up stuff. And I'm just wondering, in terms of change, did the iconography on the coins throughout the Sasanian period change a lot, or was it very much just sort of king on one side, something on the other, and it didn't change a lot? Because I'm just trying to think of like other coins from other regions that, have taken influence from certain like neighbors.
That, that,
But yeah.
that's a good question you're asking. And basically, no, the basic designs remain the same, though the symbolism will be changing and the details of it will be changing. But this is with the exception of special issues to commemorate achievements. So I mean, the coins I know best are the coins of Khusro II, even though there isn't a catalogue yet. And there are coins issued of sort of ceremonial coins at certain key points in his reign to commemorate victories. I can't tell you more straight off my head, but so yes, but it's only special issues where they were very. But I mean, there's still the basic coin may be the same. I mean, I'm trying to think whether yes, you'll always have the king on the front, but it's on the reverse that there may be a change. And then there are some where you've got a head with a flaming halo around it. But I would need notice, then I could be more precise.
No, it's totally fine. Yeah, it's always just something that has interested me, because I like Byzantine coins, and I just sort of look at coins and go, oh, I wonder, was this influenced by anything? So, I mean, I'm sure that Sasanian coins might have potentially influenced in other places, other people, but I had time, so I haven't looked into it.
Yes, their influence would have been exercised over the East, over the sort of nomad rule states and city-states of Central Asia.
Mm, okay, okay. Yeah, this just makes me want to go start looking at pictures of coins and seeing if I can see similarity. But it's sort of moving off of coins a little bit and into the more foreign relations-y aspect of your work. Now I'm trying to put on my history cap and remember what on earth was going on between Rome and Persia in late antiquity. Please correct me, because I know I get things wrong all the time when it comes to this period of history, because I just didn't really get to do a lot of late history. I got like one class. But
You're lucky getting one class. The British education, it's too specialized. We have to pick it up ourselves. We don't have enough survey courses. Anyway,
oh,
sorry to interrupt you.
no, it's fine. It's really interesting to know, because I'm always very curious by the difference in educational systems of what is even available to people. But so I know a little bit more, I guess, about the sort of warfare and the relations between the Parthians and Rome
Yeah,
before they kind of go away. But I seem to remember there's something about Romans had a conflict with the Huns, and people were sort of either captured or deported or taken unless I'm very wrong about this period of history. Was that a thing that happened where there was what was it, near like 400 BC, where, or no, it's CE, sorry, AD. I was like, wow, this is where I truly, as a classicist who studied classical Athens in school, this is
Yeah.
where I default to everything is
Yeah.
BC. But no, this is in AD, sorry. Yeah, I feel like there was a period around 400 AD where there was some sort of deportation or something, or invasion by the Huns, and then people ended up in Persia. Is that a thing that actually happened? Because I now
Well,
cannot remember.
why don't I give you a very brief
Please.
line? Basically, the relatively loose Parthian Empire that was which had suffered a series of defeats at Roman hands, after the great victory over Crassus. But the next 2 centuries basically are they're occasionally they're sort of bashed by the Romans, who can sort of do it almost at will, and Roman territory slowly advances. So from the year 205 to 6, the Sasanians. So it starts as a small, basically, they've got lordship in a small area of Fars around Istakhr, and builds up his power in stages. It's a classic example of dynamic growth of power. First unifying Fars, then pushing south and pushing west. And by the 220s, Highland Iran is basically united. I mean, basically united in a dynamic state, which is going to go on expanding. And then you have the takeover of the lowlands of Mesopotamia. And so that's up to into the 220s. And then they continue expanding westwards into Roman territory under Ardashir's successor. So in the 240s, 250s, 260s, his successor Shapur I. So a series of shattering victories, shattering for the Romans, fine victories for the Persians. All of this is in the 3rd century, when the Romans are going through a period of hyperinflation, rapid turnover of emperors. But sort of stability is introduced by the end of the 3rd century. And then basically from 298, when there was a successful Roman counter offensive, from 298 onwards, you basically got two great powers, roughly equal, and a lot of peace until the end of Constantine the Great's reign in 337, when he becomes very aggressive. He's planning a great expedition. So in the mid-4th century, there's a major warfare, which basically settles down in the 380s. And from the late 380s, for 120 years or so, you've got a period of coexistence. Then one comes into the 6th century and 7th, and you've got a series of 5 wars, each lasting longer and gaining greater intensity than the one before, until the final war, going from 603 to 630. So it's the war that precedes the Arab conquests. So there's an awful lot of fiddly work to do to try to work out what's happening. And there's a particular problem because, of course, we've got many better sources for the Roman side than the Persian side. For the Persian side, we have to rely on what many scholars, and one of them, refer to as the Quadai-Namag tradition of the Book of the Lords. This is viewing the Zoro the First and basically as sponsoring a work together, legends about the deep past and more recent history. But there's an alternative view, which is these things are actually gathered together in the 9th and 10th centuries. But the point is, we've got a fairly stable, a stabilized version of Iranian national history and mythical history, which we get in Arab histories, notably Al-Tabari, and in the great epic poem written at the turn of the 11th century. But this is very much a top-down, a sort of court-viewed history of Persia. So it is, and it's quite hard to check because we don't have enough Persian material to control it. But we have some. We got the coins. We've got inscriptions. We've got archaeological evidence. We've got Armenian sources, which give more of the Persian view. And we've got Eastern Syrian sources for more. So it is possible. In fact, I've just done it. Well, and others have done it before. But I'm writing a book at the moment, which I'm going to call Sasanian Iran, Sinews of Empire. And I've done a sort of potted history of the Sasanian Empire in 4 chapters from 205 to 6 through to 7 to the 7th century. And so I've been through this process of trying to use, but delicately, discreetly, the Persian tradition with as many controls as one can. So it's a history but it's also a historiography because it's a sort of critique of the Quadai-Nama line.
Oh, I'm very excited to see this when it comes out, and I'm sure a lot of people will be. I mean, just the title itself sounds great. Yes, I mean, thank you. That was a very wonderfully concise sort of recounting of the history from the top down, which was very helpful for myself and hopefully for other people. But as you're talking about the wars, and it's, it starts to kind of bits and pieces click in from what I learned, but it's really hard because I had this one class way back in undergrad, so this would have been 2016, 2017, whatever that was. But I wanted to ask because you were unlocking some memories that I had, and I think it was in the early, maybe before the 220s, around then. I remember something about, I think it was Emperor Caracalla was in power, and I think he sort of made waves because he like murdered like a diplomatic party or something that caused waves. And this got me thinking, the ancient Greeks obviously had the concept of xenia, like guest friendship, and all these sort of moral obligations to treat, especially diplomatic parties, with respect. And I wonder, did the Persians have like a similar system of how you treat the foreign, how you treat a diplomatic mission, very different from warfare in relates?
Yes.
And so how grievous was this if Caracalla was like murdering ambassadors or diplomats?
Well, yeah, you've got occasional aberrations, but the norm was to respect ambassadors, and the Persians did that. I mean, Khusro II didn't in when Heraclius, the Roman emperor, sent an embassy announcing his accession. He executed the ambassadors. And then 5 years later, when there were negotiations which actually took place on the Bosporus, Heraclius was on a ship and the Persian commander Shahin was on land. And they negotiated that then the Romans are able to send an embassy. Basically, they're groveling, they're suing for peace on almost any terms. And those ambassadors, they weren't executed, but they were interned and held and never returned home and died in captivity. I think one may have been executed right at the end. So, but the answer is that diplomatic norms were in force. They were universally accepted.
Okay. I guess as well, I'm sorry, my brain is working so hard to remember parts of history that are relevant here, but I seem to remember that I think during the Parthian period, there was like an exchange where sometimes royal families would sort of send someone from one court to the other. But I guess when you get a bit further down the line, I think I remember saying that sort of exchange program stopped, but are there still instances of like marriages between royal families to try to maintain diplomatic
Yes.
ties because
Oh,
they're
yes.
the two superpowers of the world at that.
Yes, yes. I think no direct exchanges of women folk between the Sasanian and Roman empires. But so on the whole, the wives come from the great aristocratic families within Iran. But there are extent exchanges with client rulers. I think Georgians and Armenians may have sort of may marry distant relations of the Shah and Shah. But it's nothing like, in the Middle Ages when marriage alliances are absolutely a crucial part of international relations. No, that's not so. But amongst other things, of course, these are imperial powers operating on a much grander scale. So, but I mean, again, there are exceptions. For example, Heraclius was married his daughter to the Khagan of the Turks. They were his allies in the war against the Persians. I mean, it was a betrothal. I'm not sure that the marriage actually took place, but and later on, I mean, you have similar Byzantine nomad marriages. Constantine V, his mother was, I think, a Khazar. Later Middle Ages, but Byzantium joins in the sort of marriage game. But again, you're stretching me a bit. You're very careful. You're going around the edges. So, right.
Sorry, I know it's an annoying habit of mine because I do know that I tend to be a very picture big, broad brushstrokes sort of investigator. It's not that, the sort of very intricate details aren't important, but it's I find myself more and more these days trying to be a sort of generalist with a broad knowledge of a lot rather
Uh,
than a lot of very specific knowledge. So, yes, if my questions are seemingly painting with broad brushstrokes, it's
uh,
probably in line with the rest of what I am currently able to spend time on these days. So that's probably just a byproduct. But yeah, I mean, I guess hopefully maybe this sort of okay, well, in terms of pivoting to just like maybe a something that is not quite as a stretch. I know in 2021 you gave a talk, I believe, on your latest book for the Portavid Institute. I believe you gave the talk on the last Great War of Antiquity.
yes, yeah.
And so, having not been able to read it or be very familiar with that period of history, the only thing I know about that is it is one of the longest wars, I think, in antiquity. And I would just love it if, since it's been quite a while since 2021, you could give a very sort of brief recap of the book and of the
Yeah.
talk, so that way I can direct people who are interested in maybe seeing that full talk. We have a recording on the Portavid's website, so because I just find that it's related to some of the things we've been talking about.
I think the talk, if I remember right, was more on the historiography of the
Hmm.
materials from which one can construct the history of the war than the war itself. Now, yeah, I could just be brief about the materials. The wonderful thing about late antiquity is some of the literary standards of high antiquity and classical Greece a dip, so that historians become more liable to reveal their sources. So letting slip a high standard of writing in which a historian would appropriate all the materials they've used and write it up in their own style. So there are various sources where you can see the outlines of documents. So one can well, and documents, you see, can convey. They can't convey the feeling of things, the attitudes, but what they can convey is data about times, places, persons, movements, actions, in the way that if you relied on unaided memory, it would be transmuted through time. So there's enough documentary material for one to be able to write some sort of pretty hard history at times. But of course, as well as documents, you need to have contemporary memories of and contemporary insights into what was going on. So that basically was the Puruvud paper. And I've incorporated the materials into a piece I've written on documents, oral tradition, and autopsy, which is the phrase used for eyewitness evidence in ancient and early medieval sources. So it's the argument that we may not be able to see it because of the fine writing, but there's documentary base, probably to what Herodotus wrote and Thucydides wrote, and the whole sequence of ancient historians. But we can start seeing it, we can start seeing it clearly in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries. But then the war. Well, basically, the war has 3 phases. And phase 1, it's basically sparked off by the coup in the Roman Empire. The army in the Balkans mutinied, marched on Constantinople, got into the city, didn't catch the emperor and his family in the city, but caught them soon after. I mean, they'd escaped. Probably didn't catch his eldest son, Theodosius. Then the family's brought back and the menfolk were executed. Now, the emperor in question, Maurice, was the emperor who had welcomed the fugitive young Khusro II, probably a teenager, and agreed to help restore him to his throne. This is in 591. So, with the pretext of avenging the death of his benefactor, but also, I dare say, anxious to redress the balance of power, because in return for restoring him to power, Maurice had extracted substantial territorial concessions from the Persians. So that it was very imbalanced. Khusro goes to war in spring 603. And the first phase of the war, which is the next 7 years, is a phase of attritional warfare, slow Persian advance westwards, until in 610, at the time of another political revolution in the Roman Empire, when Heraclius comes to the throne, the Persian army reaches the sea beyond Antioch, modern Antakya, and in the north reaches the Euphrates, where the Euphrates, which has flowed from the east, then turns south, and then to flow down in a great curve and go into the Persian Gulf. The second phase then opens of relatively swift conquest of the whole of the Roman Middle East, so Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, and of ranging campaigns into Asia Minor, one of which was a campaign in 615 which brought the general Shahin to the Bosphorus, where the negotiations take place. And by 621, Egypt has been properly absorbed within the Sasanian governmental system, and they're preparing for the final phase, which is the conquest of Asia Minor and Constantinople beyond. Now, in that phase, they've established an alliance with the Avars, who were a nomad people who had moved from the Far East to the Carpathians, basically to Hungary, whereby an alliance whereby the Persians would attack from the east and get to the Bosporus, and the Avars, with all their subject peoples, would advance on Constantinople by land. Now that took place in 626, but the siege of Constantinople, which lasted 10 days, failed. One of two Persian armies in Asia Minor was defeated, probably by Heraclius, and the Turks invaded from the north, down the west side of the Caspian Sea, through Chor, or the Caspian Gates, into Azerbaijan. And so the whole balance of power shifts in 626. But it was already, well, it hadn't shifted before, but the Roman Emperor Heraclius had set off on a counteroffensive campaign in 624, when he penetrated deep into the Persian Empire, into the northern lands, Armenia, and then Azerbaijan, and basically caused mayhem in the north, and withdrew in early spring 626, chased by one of the two Persian armies that then invaded Asia Minor. So there'd already been a counteroffensive, and after 626 there is a second counteroffensive, coordinated Roman and Turk counteroffensives, and the two armies meet outside Tbilisi, where there's a summit meeting between the Turk Kagan and Heraclius, and that's where the betrothal of Heraclius' daughter to the Kagan takes place. This is in autumn 627. Then Heraclius goes south, strikes south across the Zagros Mountains, and wins a victory near Mosul, and then marches on the metropolitan region of Ctesiphon. He can't get in because it's got a sort of outer canal, the Nahravan, which protecting it. But he can, could basically maraud at will. And then in early 628, just before the winter snows block the passes, Heraclius retreats north back to Azerbaijan, and where the Turks reappear in 628. And Heraclius' attack on the metropolitan area precipitates a putsch against Khusro II, who's basically bloodlessly overthrown on the night of 23rd, 24th February, 628, executed 4 days later on the 28th. And so we're into later 628, an embassy from the new king of kings reaches Heraclius, basically suing for peace. Meanwhile, the Turks are beginning to get hold of the Persian northwest. They first get hold of what's now northern Azerbaijan. Then they're aiming to get Georgia and Armenia. This is what's happening in the year 628 to 629. And negotiations are going on. They're complicated. But then everything changes in 629 when, because of something that's happened in the Far East, where the second Tang emperor attacks the Turks at a perfect moment of sort of Turk overstretch. And basically a message comes to the far west, to the Transcaucasus, saying, everything is lost. Get out as quickly as you can. And so we then revert in 630 to a world of two great powers, both rather battered, and when they finally agree a permanent peace. So that's the potted history of the last Great War.
That's great. Well, I'm going to encourage our listeners then, if they want to see more in depth of that talk, I will link the talk you gave for the Port of Oud in the show notes so they can easily click through to find that talk. And my goodness, the time has just flown by because I feel like we've barely gotten started with our conversation, and yet we're sitting here and it's just going so quickly. So what I'm going to do, sadly, is pivot us now. There are usually two final questions that I ask every guest on this show.
Interested in learning more about the wonders of ancient Persia? Visit the UCLA Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran. The Gazetteer digitally preserves famous locations, World Heritage sites, and lesser-known areas from all time periods of ancient Iranian history. You can explore using the interactive map or visit the encyclopedic catalog for updates to the ever-growing list of archaeological sites. Visit www.irangazetteer.ucla.edu and learn more about what the Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran has to offer.
And the first of these questions are, and you can answer this however, from whatever perspective, however you would like. They're meant to be very open-ended. So the first one is, what is the greatest legacy left to us from ancient Persia?
I suppose it must be the great monuments of sort of Persepolis and Susa. Quite extraordinary. And, the great rock reliefs. I mean, if we were talking about medieval Persia, I'd be saying poetry, because medieval Persian literature, really is second to none. I think that's the answer, the only reasonable answer to give. I mean, they were a great power. They were well organized. It's fascinating to study, but there've been lots of other great powers.
Yeah. No, that's totally fair. And the second question I have is, what, in your opinion, would be the best legacy that we as scholars now can leave for future students who want to get into Iranian studies?
Well, obviously, to show enthusiasm, to hope that enthusiasm will be infectious. I suppose, well, it's to try to get inside the mentality. And that is where I'm, much less well placed, much worse placed than others. That requires one to be able to read Pahlavi, Middle Persian script. It's absolutely awful trying to read it. and to read the sacred texts. But I think, for all past societies, polities, to understand them from the inside within their thought world, that's crucial. And secondly, to home in on the social order, but vertical ties, lords and subjects, or lords and clients, and lateral ties brought about by work or kinship and so on. So I think I'm really just simply saying the things that particularly interest me and the things that have come to the fore. So it's really thought worlds that have come to the fore in the late 20th and early 21st century. And that's where the sort of shining figure of Peter Brown really takes a lead. Otherwise, I think it's to tell everyone, you've got to go to Iran. You've got to see this extraordinary country, the extraordinary contrasts of, high mountains, desert, steppe, the rich irrigated lands. And of course, one then starts getting worried because the population, and for Iran to have a population of 93 million, terrifying, to have the water for 93 million people. It's the same problem next door in Turkey. Huge population growth and always straining the resources, the water resources of the land. But of course, water, management of water, irrigation systems, qanats, those are extraordinary feats of the ancient Persians. So basically, I would say, try to get inside the minds and try really to understand the environment, and then history of events, of social change, the economy is happening within that framework.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think it's really important to truly understand a place. You should understand its people, its history, its culture. So, I don't think you can go wrong with that strategy. But the final thing I'm going to ask is, in case someone would like to get in touch to ask a question, know something about something you've written, where can they do so?
Well, my email address. They just email me. Or next year, I hope the book on in Iran, I hope it will be out. I mean, what it consists of is an introduction where I talk about the sources, but I'm also trying to talk about the thought world through the sources. And then 4 chapters of political history. And then I have 3 chapters on sort of institutions, finance, army, provincial administration. Then there are 3 chapters. One is on the India trade. One is on grand strategy, the Sasanian Empire. And the final one is on the coming of the Arabs to Iran. Now, all those 6 chapters, they all exist. They were all published as papers. I've got to rejig them, update them. But I'm not that far off. I should be able to get it to the press by the end of the year.
Great. Well, yeah, as I said, I'll link that in the show notes. I can drop your email if anyone wants to get in contact with you. And then do you maintain an academia page or a ResearchGate page?
Not really, no. I mean, under Oxford University, I'm there. But I think the research, being retired, I don't have to keep it updated. And but basically they look me up, they'll find me on Google. They'll find some other podcasts too.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. Well, thank you again for joining me. It's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast today.
Pleasure for me too. Thank you so much.
Legacies of Ancient Persia is a Portavood podcast production, hosted and edited by Lexi Henning, with select episodes co-hosted by Marissa Stevens. Cover art provided by Hadley Leesman and original music by Brent Arhart. Established in 2017 as the premier research center for the study of ancient Iran, the mission of the Purdue Institute for the Study of the Iranian World is to engage in transformative research on all aspects of Iranian antiquity, including its reception in the medieval and modern periods, by expanding on the traditional domains of old Iranian studies and promoting cross-cultural and interdisciplinary scholarship. Thanks for listening to our show. It's available to stream on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Purdue Institute and at Purdue UCLA, or visit our website, purdue.ucla.edu. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and review us. For podcast inquiries or questions about the Purdue Institute, please email us at purduepodcastproduction@gmail.com. We'll see you next time as we continue our deep dive into the legacies of ancient Persia.